Well, I was born in Los Angeles, in Inglewood actually, which is out by the International Airport. My family, my mother's family came from Illinois about 10 years earlier, and my father was a kind of a wanderer, and he wound up out in San Pedro, which is not far from Los Angeles, and that's where they met. He had been in an orphanage and had run away and had gone away to sea when he was 14 and wandered all over the world and then wound up at the seaport in San Pedro. And my mother, her family came out from Illinois where the coal mines had played out and they had no future, so they came to California. So in a sense, even though neither of my parents were from Oklahoma, we were like Okies. We were in the sense of the Okies of the Grapes of Wrath. My father worked for a while in an aircraft plant. He wasn't very steady. He moved around an awful lot. They had a baby when they were only 16 and 17 years old themselves, and my brother was born in 1930, and then I was born in 1935. They were together part of the time and part of the time not, most all that while. I think they finally separated when that was about 2 or 3 years old. My mother worked as a drugstore clerk. She did that for, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 years. Not much of a position, but paid a salary and was steady work, and she liked to sell cosmetics. But we were basically working class people, although none of us were. My father worked in a factory, but none of us were factory workers in the sense of the Marxist sense of the term. But we were poor. My mother had a hard time getting along on our drugstore clerk salary, and we had a little house in Inglewood, California, where we grew up. Gradually, my father became more ambitious, and he actually became a salesman in the early 40s, at the beginning of the war, and he sold tools and machinery to aircraft plants, and he started making better money. And we had this situation where he's living up in Los Angeles, making pretty good money and doing all right and driving around in a nice car. And my mother was down in Inglewood and very, very poor, and we were having a hard time getting along. And I think there was also a feeling that my mother was somehow being cheated out of her youth by having these 2 boys at home and to have to support them herself. So my father volunteered to send us off to military school. Military things were very prominent, of course, and everybody was in the military who could possibly go. And my father had the idea that this will make a man out of him. This will be discipline, and this will be the kind of thing that will be good for him. So we went off to military school in the San Fernando Valley for 3 years. Not at all as you might think of it in military school. It was a little dirty and a little run down, and some of the faculty and staff were not fit to be teachers in a school like that. And there was a lot of difficulty, a lot of punishing of the children for homosexual activities, and a lot of other things like that. I mean, we're talking children that are under 10. So one of the things that happened while I was there was that they had the first half of the year and the second half of the year both in the same class. Because it's a very small school, so they didn't have a separate class for 4A and 4B. So when I was in the 4A and 4B, and 5A and 5B, I did all the work for the 5A and 5B for both classes, while the others were, just doing one. And I became so advanced in the school that they put me ahead a year. So when we left military school in about 1946, I went back to public school, and I moved on to the 7th grade, even though I had never been in the 6th grade. And at that time, in the 7th grade, I was only 11 years old. So I was always young and always small in all my school years. The other part is that my parents were extraordinarily irresponsible, especially my father. And he drank an awful lot. And he shouted an awful lot when he was drunk. And I knew that most of what he said was bullshit. And I had no respect whatsoever for anything that he had to say, because he was such a dumb idiot that he was always mad about something that it just seemed inconsequential, and seemed that he could think it through if he just gave it a try, but he didn't. So not only was I smarter than everybody else, but also I developed a lack of respect for authority very early on. And I have always had a strong disrespect for authority. I've always had a cantankerous inner feeling of hostility to authority all my life. We went back to Inglewood, went to Crozier Junior High School, and then I went to Los Angeles to the Dorsey High School. And when I finished, I was still only 16 years old. And I found a job in Elko, Nevada, way out in the desert, working on the highway construction crew. And I'm just a tiny little guy, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and very babyish and not, very mature. And I'm living out there by myself with all these roughnecks, working on the highway construction crew, and it was quite an education for me. But after doing that, I then went back to school. My mother had remarried and moved on to Reno, Nevada, and so I wouldn't see her very much. My father, who was something of an alcoholic and a man who spent an awful lot of time away from home, I grew up with a stepmother, or I spent some years with a stepmother, and my father and stepmother separated, and there was a lot of disarray and violence and difficulties, and so I moved out and was living on my own when I was still 16. I spent a lot of time driving around with the other boys in cars, a lot of time cruising the streets, and typical 1950s California style existence. The only difference was that I lived in a little hotel and all my friends lived at home. And during that time, I got into some trouble, ran out of a gas station without paying for the gas and got charged with petty theft and little things like that. Drank a little too much. But then the following year, in 1953, a friend said, who was the year behind me, so he's just starting in school, he says, I'm going to go out to El Camino Community College, and I'm going to study business and get a good job when I finish. And I thought that sounded good, so I did that with him. And we studied accounting and economics and business math and things like that. And I thought of myself as a person who's preparing to become a business student. And after 2 years at El Camino, I went to UCLA, and I stayed there for about 3 semesters, took all the advanced courses in business and accounting and things like that. But then I got married. I married a young woman named Mary Jane Thompson, who she had 2 children. We had 2 children very soon thereafter. And by about 1958, I was living with her and having 2 children and trying to make a living and still go to school. And I gave that up. I gave up the school. And that was an unfortunate situation. I was not prepared emotionally or psychologically to support a family or to carry on a regular job or to do anything like that. And we got deeper into debt, and eventually we separated, and I went kind of like on the road. I went up to Modesto, California, where I hooked up with a portrait photographer. He was a guy who would go from town to town. He would set up a new business, a new photo studio, or something that looked like a new photo studio. And I was the front man. I was the one that would go into a new town and set up an office, sometimes in a motel, but sometimes in an office building downtown. And we would hire a bunch of young women and put in several phone lines and have these young women call all the telephone numbers in the telephone book. And they would ask, we're calling from Dawn Studios and we're opening a new studio in town. We'd like to make you an introductory offer. You can win 2 8x10 portraits for $1.89 or something if you can answer the following question. What famous president is on the $5 bill? We made pretty good money, but it was an alienated existence. That is, we were like traveling hucksters of some kind, had a lot of adventures in small towns, especially with young girls. During that time, I didn't have that much to do. The women did the calling, somebody else did this delivering of the certificate and collecting the money, and I was more or less managing the thing. And I spent more and more of my time in the daytime in the library. I go to the public library and read. And I read enormous amounts. Before then, I had no idea what an intellectual was. And I had no idea what serious study was, or even a serious appreciation of art and philosophy and things like that. I had zero idea. In the home I grew up in, there was never a book. Nobody ever read a book, except my mother would sometimes read Gone with the Wind or Forever Amber or some kind of popular romantic novels. And I never read anything except what they required me to read in school. And yet I had an interest and a kind of an incentive to learn more. I wanted to know more about the real world. And I read an awful lot. And a lot of it was like Hemingway and Steinbeck and other famous novelists of the time. But I also read some philosophy and became just a little bit more educated and a little bit more aware of what was going on in the world outside of the little neighborhood I lived in. And when I finally gave up the idea of working on the photography, it didn't seem all that ethical, and it didn't seem all that legitimate, and made pretty good money, and I had a pocket full of money most of the time. I didn't really feel very satisfied about what I was doing. So I up and moved to San Francisco. I just got in my car one day and said goodbye to my friends in the photography business and drove off to San Francisco. And within 2 or 3 days, I was enrolled in summer school in the University. It was then called San Francisco State College. And I started studying politics and philosophy and sociology. And those things interested me a great deal. And within 2 years, I had graduated from San Francisco State. Now, during that time, this was about 1959 when I went to San Francisco, and that's at the time when San Francisco was very much dominated by something they called the beatniks. And they influenced me a lot. I was very much influenced by the beatniks. I don't think I could actually say I ever became a beatnik, but I was very much influenced by them, and I spent a lot of time with them down on North Beach in San Francisco. You know, they were very anti-authoritarian, and so was I. And that's something that we had very much in common. And then while I was in San Francisco, there were always things like peace marches. And there were some famous hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which took place in San Francisco in 1960, the year I arrived there. And people picketed it and demonstrated against it. And this House committee was trying to get a lot of teachers fired for being lefties. And people were protesting against it. The fire department came, squirted everybody down the steps of the city hall in San Francisco with their fire hoses, and people bumping and falling and getting hurt. And I was there. And there were peace marches where people were demonstrating against nuclear weapons. 1960 again, this is a time when nuclear testing had recently been a very prominent part of America's weapon development program, and eventually disarmament became a very prominent issue in the United States. So I participated in those. And there was also at San Francisco State a small club, I forgot the name of it now, which was a kind of a radical left-wing group, maybe a socialist group, I don't remember. But I joined it. And when I first joined that organization, there were communists in it. There were people who were children of communists or other Communist Party members who were meeting with this group to try and influence the group to become more left or more communist or something. And I was very much anti-communist. And I was very distrustful of the people who pretended to really know Marxist Leninism and to know what we really should do, as opposed to the naive rest of us didn't know what we needed to do and needed to be herded. I would take a very liberal, critical point of view toward the things that they suggested that the club do. And I became known as a liberal while I was still at San Francisco. But there are intellectual weaknesses in the liberal position which I can't abide, and I've never been since then very much of a liberal, because it strikes me that as a liberal you're on the horns of a dilemma between making the existing society work properly and transforming society to make it work better. And so while I was being a liberal, I was being criticized and being constantly in arguments with the radicals, the lefties, the communists, and they influenced me. They influenced me a lot. And so for a while there was a distance between my conversational attitude toward radical politics and what I read in books. But I finished my 2 years at State College and graduated. One time somebody said to me, "Why don't you take the graduate record examination?" And what's that? And it turns out it's an examination that determines the aptitude that people have for graduate work in universities. And I thought, well, I'll take it and see. I've always been pretty good at taking tests, and so I took the graduate record examination and got marks that were way off the scale. And my teachers took another look at me. They said, "How do you get such a high score? And you don't do that well in my class." But in fact, I was doing better and better in school and getting better and better grades. And they up and awarded me a 3-year scholarship, fellowship actually it was called, to the University of Iowa to study international relations in 1961. I had been more and more interested in international relations, and they had a specialty in that study at San Francisco State, and so that's where I really got started with my ideas of the broader world, studying Africa, Asia, and Latin America. things like that. So I went off to Iowa. When I got to Iowa in graduate school, I began a reading project into radical philosophy, Marxism, and other things of the similar nature. And so that's the direction I took. Oh, one other thing. No, nobody in my family, nobody in my group of friends had any political views whatsoever when I was a kid. They really didn't have any political point of view, and they really weren't interested, and they thought political discussions were stupid, and they had no interest in, and for a long time, neither did I. But when I got into college and got into graduate school and started reading seriously, I changed my view quite strongly and became a person whose thinking is characterized by political points of view much more strongly than most people. They had a socialist discussion club there. Mild sounding name, and it was a very mild organization in 1961. There weren't very many radical groups on campuses in those days, and there were none at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, except for the Socialist Discussion Group. So I joined it and very soon became the president of it, and started inviting prominent socialists and communists from around the United States to come and visit the campus and give speeches. And this, of course, in these days is very controversial, and a lot of people thought it was subversive and hated that we were doing it. And so I became a kind of a controversial figure on campus because I was the president, and they'd show a picture of a communist who just made a speech, and I'd be standing there next to him. And of course, we were thought of by most of the people in Iowa City as communists, but we weren't really. And at that time, I really didn't have a good idea of what communism was. I certainly had never studied Marx. But then while I was in that 3 years in Iowa, I did study Marx. I became very, very interested in Marxism. And in particularly, I became very interested in the revolutions that were taking place at that time in the Third World. You know, 1960 was the crowning year of independence for African Asian countries. Many, many countries became independent in that year, and more afterwards. And I studied that, and I studied that in connection with Marxism, and I became something of a radical. So here I am, finishing up my 3 years of graduate work, becoming something of a radical, and not knowing what to do. But I was able to get a job at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And I taught there for 2 years. They had a program called the United Nations Semester. And Drew was a very small school, and there are a lot of other small schools around the southeast and eastern part of the country that don't have very much facility for studying things like international relations or UN, the United Nations. So we had students come to Drew University from all over the country to spend 1 semester there studying at the UN. And we had an office across the street from the UN at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And 2 days a week, these students and I would all go down to New York from Drew in New Jersey and spend the day at the UN twice a week. And we had speakers come from all the different missions to the United Nations. We had speakers from the various offices of the Secretariat. And it was an intensive study of the UN. I did that for 4 semesters in 65 and 66. So while I was in New York, I became a very active political radical type in various organizations all around the city, and especially at places like City College in Columbia. I was on those campuses a lot, and became much more intense about my radical political activity. During my first year at Drew University, I met some people who had just come back from Cuba. The revolution started in January of 1959, or it was successful in January of 59, and within a year or two, groups of U.S. students were traveling to Cuba to study the revolutionary situation. And we had an organization, I think it was called Hands Off Cuba. I think it was called Hands Off Cuba. And we supported the Cuban Revolution, and we made speeches and showed movies and gave demonstrations and things about Cuba around the city. And some of these people who were friends of mine went to Cuba for a trip to just become familiar with what was going on down there. And when they came back, we all got together and we determined to start something we called the Free University of New York. The one guy who was more or less the leader of our group, Allen Krebs, had just been fired. He was an assistant professor in sociology, I think, at a school in Long Island, and he would teach Marxism in his courses.
The American university has been emasculated. Its intellectual vigor, exuberance, and excitement have been destroyed. What remains is a dispassionate and studied dullness, a facade of scholarly activity concealing an internal emptiness and cynicism, a dusty, dry search for permissible truth which pleases none but the administrator and the ambitious.
Who runs his university? And if it's run by a board of trustees, made up of bankers, professionals, businessmen, let's say from AT&T, IBM, and so on, they're not going to be interested in new ideas. They're going to be interested in preparing students for the role they're going to have to accept in this society. And that is working for corporations, government, private, military.
Politics, art, things concerning sexual activity and sexual behavior, all of these basically fall into a proscribed kind of bag and are not permitted expression. And so what we have attempted to do would be to provide a place where these proscribed ideas can be interchanged, can be expressed and communicated. And naturally, the fact that our courses are heavily weighted in a political direction only reflects the fact that in the university establishment, political considerations, socio-political affairs receive very little attention, almost no attention. I have a PhD in social psychology. I've worked in sociology departments for a considerable length of time. And one of the things that impressed me was the degree to which, as a student of sociology, the kinds of ideas, radical ideas circulating during our times, contemporary with us, C. Wright Mills, for example, were never given any serious consideration whatsoever. They didn't exist.
And so we had a fired professor to be leader of our organization. And within not very long, I became a fired professor as well. What happened was that there was a Marxist historian of some considerable reputation and credentials, a very good historian who wrote some very important books, Eugene Genovese. And because he was Marxist, the politicians in New Jersey were trying to get him fired from the staff at Rutgers University. And because of the firing and because of all the controversy about having a Marxist on the teaching staff, they held a teach-in, one of the first teach-ins. This is very early on when the war in Vietnam was not yet quite so hot, and there were not quite so many Americans over there, and the anti-war movement was not yet so well developed. but we had a teach-in, and I was invited. Now, he had made a statement in which he had said, this is Eugene Genovese, had made a statement in public saying, I welcome the forthcoming victory of the Vietnamese people in their war against the United States.
I spoke at a teach-in on the question of academic freedom, and I inserted in my remarks a repetition of Genovese's statement, that is Professor Genovese at Rutgers, that I didn't fear or regret the impending Viet Cong victory in Vietnam, that in fact I welcomed it. The president immediately formed a faculty committee to consider the matter, consider my continuance at the university. And 2 weeks later, the Board of Trustees met and announced that my remarks had been totally irresponsible and contrary to everything Drew stands for as a Christian institution. And they announced that I would not be rehired next year. I'd in fact be fired at the end of the year. One of the other things I said at that teach-in was that I expressed my political viewpoints in classroom every day, and I thought that anybody who didn't was abdicating his responsibilities. What I meant was that I encouraged political discussion and debate in my class, and I encouraged the students to formulate their own ideas. The only way I can do that is to give them mine. I have an obligation to give them mine. My students know what I stand for the first day of the class, and the whole semester they are in a process of having to deal with my ideas. All right, tonight we're going to talk about guerrilla warfare, and we're going to talk about it in a largely theoretical vein.
So they said that they were going to not rehire me because I hadn't finished my doctoral dissertation. But the real reason they fired me was because they just didn't want to call me on the staff. And it provoked quite a lot of controversy. The New York Times wrote an editorial denouncing the idea that I should be fired because of my views. The ACLU held a meeting and endorsed my situation and offered to give me free legal help. And Bill Kunstler, I don't know if you remember Bill Kunstler, but he was a famous civil rights lawyer from the 60s, a very dynamic guy. He offered to be my lawyer for free. So we fought it, but of course, there really wasn't any basis for fighting it because they said they were firing me because I had not finished my dissertation, and indeed, I was only 6 months out of graduate school. I had indeed not finished my dissertation. And we lost, but we put a big fight and had a lot of fun campaigning about the lack of academic freedom in New York, particularly in Drew University in New Jersey. So the Free University went on. I taught there, taught about American imperialism and the instruments of U.S. foreign policy and things like that. Anyway, I got quite a lot of publicity out of that. So I'm the fired professor, and I'm the Free University advocate, and my time in New York gradually ran out, and I was finished with my 2 years at Drew. But the one thing I did do is I sat down and I found a used desk at a used furniture store, and I worked on it meticulously, refurnishing this desk so that it was just a beautiful desk. And I worked on it for a month. Then I sat down at the desk and wrote my dissertation. And I spent about 12 or 14 weeks working night and day on my dissertation, and before the year was out, I finished my dissertation. My doctoral dissertation was on the subject of the foreign activities of the AFL-CIO. And then in the spring of 1966, I'm there finishing up my teaching, no prospect whatsoever for another job, because nobody wants to hire a fired communist professor. So I wrote a few letters around. Connor Cruz O'Brien, who was a famous Irishman who had been an official of the Secretariat of the United Nations and who was at this time that this was happening, was the chancellor of the University of Accra in Ghana. I wrote a letter to him saying, do you have any ideas about where I might teach? because I don't think I'm going to find a teaching job in the United States. And he wrote back saying, yeah, they want someone in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. And the professor from Dar es Salaam, in British universities, the professor is the head of the department. He came to New York, interviewed me, and hired me, and I got a 4-year contract, 2 years with an option to teach 2 more, to teach political science and international relations at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. As usual, I got into a tangle with the faculty at the University of Dar es Salaam within weeks after arriving. They had a real upheaval in their student body. The president of Tanzania, President Nyerere, expelled all the Tanzanian students. They had students there from Kenya and Uganda, but he expelled all the Tanzanian students because they had protested against having to do 2 years of national service after finishing their university training. And so the school was really ripped apart by political factions, and I joined a group of faculty members, mostly from Britain, but a few Italians and Scandinavians and other faculty members who were on the left, and we formed a faculty group in favor of left-wing policies in Tanzania, right at the time that President Nyerere was declaring the country to be a socialist country. So I immediately got on the wrong side of the faculty there. While I was in Africa, I had this sense, at least at going there, that Africa is a new country, or Tanzania is a new country. They didn't become independent until '62. And they need a lot of help, and they have very few university-trained people. So me being a teacher on their faculty and having a left-wing point of view at the time that their country is declaring itself to be a socialist country, my idea was that I can help. Well, wasn't there very long before I realized that there's real problems with that. There are real problems with that. The phrase that sticks in my mind is, the medium is the message. If you're white and European and you're an expert, a PhD, and you're teaching students, you're not teaching them to overcome the white dominating power structure. You're teaching them implicitly that you know what you're talking about and they need to learn what you know. And you don't become powerful by learning what other people think you ought to know. And so I began to see that we as faculty members, white faculty members who were there because we wanted to help, because it was a wonderful enterprise what they were doing in that country, I began to realize that we weren't doing that much good, and that we were in some ways even doing harm. I spent a lot of time with the Student Radical Club. The students had a little radical club too, I don't remember what it's called. And I spent a lot of time with them. And I wasn't married, and most of the other faculty members were. And I could afford to spend a lot of time with the young people on the campus, whereas most of the faculty members lived in their flats, way away from the campus and didn't have that much to do with the students outside of class. And I spent a lot of time with the students. And the students are all African, even if they're from Tanzania and Uganda, or Kenya, they're all African. Nevertheless, we were close. And I spent a lot of time with one student. During one of the long vacations, we took a safari throughout Tanzania and visited every one of the regions and every one of the regional administrators and political people who ran the various regional offices. And we really studied the politics of Tanzania in detail. And he and I did this together. And there were no other faculty members doing anything like that, being, particularly close with the African students. So it had a lot of effect on me to think, I've got to go home. Now, they're marching on the Pentagon. They're doing all kinds of things to put a stop to the war in Vietnam. Blacks are rioting in the cities. The country's in an upheaval, and I'm here in Africa, and I'm not doing any good out here. So I went home. I decided to come back, and in the school year ended in April, and I got on an airplane. I stopped in Hungary for a while and visited some faculty members from the university who had gone home to Hungary. And I met a lot of people in Hungary who had participated in the revolution against the Soviets in 1956. And that was a very interesting and politically informative time of mine. It wasn't just any longer that I was just from the neighborhood and knew something about what the politics in my neighborhood were, but I really started to understand a lot about the world and communist world and what it was like to be a left-wing person living in Hungary when the Soviet Union was dominating the country. But I got home on, I think, April 2nd, which I think is the day or the day after Martin Luther King was murdered. And the cities in the northeast of this country just went up in smoke. So I was in Washington, D.C. for a few days, and the city was on fire. They were burning, large neighborhoods were burning, and stores were being destroyed, and people were in the streets and by the thousands, and many people were shot.
The main thing for the police was to control that, restore crowd control, and to protect property and lives wherever you possibly could.
And it became a very much important part of United States politics that the African Americans were in rebellion. And that influenced me very heavily. I got back, I went to New York, stayed a few days, went to Washington, D.C. and stayed a few days. Then I came back to New York. And John Jacobs, who was a student at Columbia, I had known him at the Free University for the years before I went to Africa. He invited me to come up to Columbia and make a speech about Africa. So I went up there. I went to the room where it was to happen, and nobody but JJ was there. And I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "We've taken over Hamilton Hall, and we got a revolution going here at Columbia." And I said, "Well, good. Take me to Hamilton Hall." So I went to Hamilton Hall, and I stayed in there all night, and the police came in the morning, and for some reason they didn't arrest me. And then some students actually seized the office of the president at the university and wouldn't come out, and they had to be eventually driven out by police with nightsticks. And it was a considerable tumult at Columbia, and this was like, I'm back 2 or 3 days, I'm back from Africa 2 or 3 days, and here I am in the thick of it. So I got to know the Columbia leadership very well, and I spent a lot of time hanging out in the buildings where the people were sitting in to hold on to the buildings. And then I bought a car. I bought a little sports car, a Triumph TR2, and I traveled around the United States, completely around. I wanted to know what was going on in the radical movement, and I wanted to know what was going to be my role, what was the place for me to put myself. And then when I got home, I traveled all over the country, as I was saying. I got a lot of names from people that I knew, and I'd stop and I'd call on people who were working in radical activities of various kinds in the cities all over the country. It took me about 3 months. And I learned a lot. One of the things that I learned was that the Students for a Democratic Society was a different kind of organization than I had thought it was. When I was in New York, I was a member of something called the May 2nd movement, which it name commemorates an activity that took place on May 2nd one time or another. And it was a radical group, and it was a group of people with a political view that the third world is in rebellion against American imperialism, and the parts of the United States which are representative of the third world, such as the African Americans and the Latinos, they're part of the revolution. And that point of view, we called it internationalist sometimes, or sometimes called it third world politics, but that point of view was that the main focus of change in the United States now is not the class struggle between the industrial workers and the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, but the main function of the class struggle in the United States was between imperialism and the third world.
Nixon praises Castillo Armas, the president of Guatemala, for overthrowing a communist regime. What Nixon doesn't say is that Castillo Armas was handpicked by the CIA, that his army was financed and trained by the CIA, and that Castillo Armas didn't lead a popular uprising against a communist regime, but was the head of a CIA-sponsored military coup.
And that the best thing that the people in the United States could do who wanted to express radical politics or effect socialist revolution was to support the third world movement. And of course, at that time, there was a violent war going on in Vietnam, and millions of people are being killed, but there were lots of other wars going on at the same time. At that time, the Chinese government weekly, I think it's called Red Flag, published an article by Lin Piao, who was a #3 man in China at the time, called Long Live the Victory of the People's War. And the article by Lin Piao interpreted the world just as I had been just saying, that in the Chinese Revolution, they had to conquer but they had to win over the countryside before they could ever win over the cities. And that in the contemporary situation, the analogy was that the countryside was the third world, the poor parts of the world, and the imperialist countries, the United States and Europe, the best strategy for changing those countries was to bring about a victory of the Third World's war against imperialism. I was a follower of Lin Piao for a while there, and that was the definition of the politics that I began to promote. But when I got back to the United States and I started traveling the country and visiting lots and lots of campuses, I discovered that the real radical politics in the country were in the SDS chapters. Even if the national leadership wasn't so radical, the chapters were. And so I decided to work in the SDS. Now, SDS, of course, was not a particularly revolutionary organization in its first several years. They had a lot of radical perspectives and interesting ideas, but they shied away from any kind of talk of revolution, and they shied away from any kind of contact with any communists. They kept communists out of their organization. And I wasn't a communist, but I was a person who, I thought the communists were mild. I thought the communists were the ones who were mainly working to promote the interests of the Soviet Union and not the revolutionaries in their own countries that they claimed to be. So I joined SDS. I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they had a little organization there called the Radical Education Project. And it was, I guess you could call it a left-wing think tank, although it was more like a pamphlet publishing house. We printed and distributed large numbers of pamphlets of excellent articles of radical politics and things like that. And we also promoted radical educational projects on, or activities on college campuses all over. Like there was a very famous film made about the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then some left-wing filmmakers made a film in opposition to the one made by HUAC. And we used to go around and show those two films.
The pamphlet is a sample of communist propaganda. It is published by an organization officially cited as a communist front. It is, at this instant, being distributed throughout the United States by dedicated hardcore communist agents and their dupes. This pamphlet and numerous others like it play a major role as artillery in one phase of the communist war to destroy our nation. A phase called by the communists Operation Abolition.
And a lot of our organizing work was very effective in bringing people to hear our speeches and then talk about things afterwards. And a lot of times people would come up afterwards and want to be part of what we were doing. We had other movies too. There was a radical group in New York. They called themselves UAWMF, which stood for Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker. This is the stick up or something like that. And it all comes from a poem by Amiri Baraka, who is a New Jersey poet and radical black nationalist. They did things like they called guerrilla theater. And they would go about to places on the Lower East Side or on college campuses and put on little shows that had a radical message of some kind or other. And they were, of course, exhibitionists and very dramatic, flamboyant people and colorful. And they had a lot of influence on what went on in the various campuses. And we had a film of their, and 2 or 3 films of their activities in New York, which we would show around various campuses in the U.S. And
palaces of culture.
It was a way of sort of finding out what we were up to as a group.
We'll not negotiate with it or let it take our ships. But we are faced with a revolt of the garbage, a cultural revolution. Garbage fertilizers discovered itself. And we of the Lower East Side have decided to bring this cultural revolution to Lincoln Center. Is not Lincoln Center where it belongs?
There's something better in garbage than Lincoln Center.
That was a time in the early part of 1969 that the American youth were just ready for the most radical of politics. And they cheered for anything that was anti-authoritarian, anything that was against the government, anything that was against racism. And it was very easy to show a movie or hold a talk and then have hundreds of them come in and want to talk more and more and more. And sometimes we'd invite them back to our house and drink all night and get stoned and do whatever else people did in those days. But we'd also recruit a large number of people. So a lot of people would just move into our houses as soon as they've discovered us. It was what they were looking for. And we used to say to them, now remember, we're the people your parents warned you against. And they loved it. They just lapped it up. So our political activities, our outreach and organizing activities that we did through the Radical Education Project were very, very effective. We took an interest in the SDS chapter at Ann Arbor. Bill Ayers was there, and Diana Oughton and Terry Robbins. They lived there. They ran a little community school. They were actually school reform activists. And they ran a little community school. It was a little bit like a child care center, but they did progressive things. They did them in progressive ways. They did them in non-conflictual and non-violent ways and things like that. But they were ready to take on a bigger political project, Diana, Bill, and Terry. And I joined with them, and within, I don't know, 2 weeks we had 25 or 30 people who were full-time ready to take over the chapter of the SDS in Ann Arbor. And the people who had previously run the SDS were very disorganized and demoralized. The radical politics that was taking over the country left them way behind, and they were demoralized about what direction to take, and they gave in very easily. They just went away. And within a few weeks, we were the chapter of SDS in Ann Arbor. We went to some public meetings, and we made some demonstrations, and we made some fusses, started a few fights, and things like that. And we called ourselves the Jesse James Gang. I don't know who started that or how it got started or anything, but it fell by the wayside within a few months. But we started out as the Jesse James Gang in Ann Arbor. But then groups of people in Chicago and in New York and in Kent State, and some people in Cleveland, I don't know exactly, we started getting together regularly and having discussions about the direction of SDS. Now, SDS in those years, they probably had 100,000 or 200,000 members if you counted everybody who identified with them. If you counted everybody who carried a card, they probably were none. But there are 200,000 or 300,000 people who worked with SDS on a fairly regular basis. And the SDS national leadership had a practice of having a quarterly meeting at a university campus someplace in the middle of the country every 3 months. And the first one that I went to was in Boulder, Colorado in September of 1968. And I made a few speeches there, and Bill and Diana made a few speeches, and we started winning people over to the idea of a radical internationalist or third world politics within SDS. And the other thing is that, in those days we had a lot of contempt for local police and for the FBI and for their ability to do what they thought they were doing, which was to find out the radicals and expose them and charge them with crimes when it was possible. They were very, very unsuccessful. And they were stupid. And they would come to my door, two FBI agents come lunking up and knock on my door and say, "I want to talk to you." And then they would say stupid things that they did to show that they didn't understand anything about what we were doing or who we were or what the politics were that are about. And they say, "How many communists in your group?" I don't know how many communists there are in the group. It doesn't make any difference. So we were very contemptuous of the police. And yet we knew they were provocateurs. We knew that they thought that if they could trigger us into violent confrontation, they could use violence to suppress us, and they thought that would discourage us. We knew that if they used violence to suppress us and we responded with violence to defend ourselves, that we would become the heroes of the campus movements. And the people loved us for the way we fought back. And And so we weren't even the prime beginners of violence. Before long, we were doing it. We were doing it a lot. I can't think of the number of times I've taken a swing at a policeman or thrown a body block at his knees on the side of his body or something like that in order to move policemen out. And this is, of course, nothing like me. I have no qualities of violence in me at all, and I have very little physical ability, and I had to learn. I had to learn how to conduct myself so that I would be as militant as my friends. But I did. I got pretty good at it. And then we formed a group during the year 68, 69, probably in about January of 69, which was going to be a group to nominate the leadership for the national office of the SDS the following June. They had conventions every quarter, but on the main convention was in June, and that's when the election officers were elected. And we got together, 10 of us, and we talked endlessly about who should be the next national leader. And for a long time, people were talking about I should be the next national leader. And I didn't really like that very much. As brash as I might sound at times, I actually lack self-confidence about a lot of things, and I didn't really feel like I could hold it together, that I could be the leader, be the symbol, be the person who inspired everybody else, and keep everybody else's confidence. And I sort of backed out of it. The group was made up of Bill Ayers, John Jacobs, I told you, JJ, Jeff Jones, who was a New York SDS activist, Mark Rudd from Columbia, Jerry Long, and me, Bernadine Dorn. Now, Bernadine had already been active in the SDS for a year or two before me, and before most of us who were in that group, but she became our leader pretty quickly. She's an interesting character. I wish something better had been written about her by now, because she was such a fascinating character. Bernadine was, one, she was stone gorgeous. She was just beautiful. But she also had a flair. She wore high leather boots up above her knees, and she wore characteristic colors. She always wore purple. And she had a charismatic quality that motivated people around her a lot. And this is at a time when the SDS is a largely male organization, and a lot of the women saw themselves as more or less, what's that word? I can't think of the word, but more or less as an appendix to the organization. Gradually, over a period of time, more and more women became popular leaders of the organization, and it began to be dominated by women eventually. But early on, it was a very male chauvinist outfit. And we decided eventually to name Bernadine Dorn as our candidate for the presidency of the SDS. And of course, you can imagine that the internal dynamics of our group turned a great deal on the sexuality of Bernadine Dorn. At one time or another, every one of us were her lover, except me. I never was, but all the others were. And for a while, she was with Jeff Jones, sometimes with John Jacobs, and then she eventually wound up with Bill Ayers, and she's still with Bill Ayers, I think. I wrote a paper. I described what I thought the political situation in the United States was, and about the Third World Revolution, and about how important it was for us to support the Vietnamese and to make sure that the guerrilla forces around the world were winning their revolutions against imperialism, and published it in the SDS newspaper. And my friends, the 10 people I was associated with, who had been talking about me being the national leader, didn't like it that much. And something happened at that point, which I didn't realize the full extent of for 9 more months. But there began to be a difference between me and the other people in the leadership of what eventually became the Weatherman. They wrote a statement without consulting me, which we were sitting around one day in a meeting, and the newspaper editor from the SDS newspaper called and said, "We got to have a title. We got it all set in print. We're ready to go. What's the title?" And I said, "Well, how about The Pump Don't Work 'Cause the Vandal Took the Handle?" And somebody else said, no, what about You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows? And so that's how we got the name Weatherman. That's how we became called Weatherman, because of a line from a Bob Dylan song. They put all 10 of our names on it. We behaved as what some people like to call in those cases democratic centralism, which meant that if you were in agreement with the group, you could speak for the group, but if you were not in agreement with the group, you would keep silent and you wouldn't speak outside the group. And we would always present ourselves as a united front. I didn't read it until we showed up in Chicago and they were distributing it on the street. And the thing is that statement is a little bizarre. I mean, I never subscribed to very much that was in it. One of the most important things in that statement was the notion that black people can stage a revolution in the United States and win and take over a part of the United States for their own homeland without white support. You know, black people make up 10-12% of the population in the United States. And the idea that they're going to stage a revolution and win a revolution in the United States without white support struck me as crazy. I don't think we even debated the ideas in that statement in a meeting in which I was present. And I think that there were half a dozen, or a few anyway, people in the group who were a little embarrassed by some of the extreme stuff in the paper. But they stuck to the leadership and stuck to the consensus point of view. We all moved from Ann Arbor to Detroit, and we rented houses over there, and we began a citywide organizing movement for the summer of '69. And I wrote that paper. I think Bill's name is on it with me. Most of them were heavily influenced by my ideas. And I was a talker. I talked a lot. And everywhere we went, people would say, "Jim, get up and say something." And I would get up and I would make long speeches. Not as long as Fidel Castro, but long. And everybody heard me speak at some point or another. And if I had any reputation as a leader, it was because of the speeches that I made. Although you have to put your mind back to where we were at that time, because we weren't very particularly impressed by university professors and scholarly credentials. When I first met Bill, he said, "Oh, I've been hearing about you." And I said, "What'd you hear?" And he said, "Well, I hear you were a college professor and then you've been out in Africa, Peace Corps or something." And I said, "Well, yeah, I was. I just got back from Africa." And he said, "Well, you can imagine what we thought." And by that he meant a college professor, or an academic, an intellectual. Fuck him. So I had to win Bill over. Well, like Bill Ayers was a very gregarious, very attractive guy who everybody loved. And when we would go someplace, like we'd drive up to East Lansing and we'd visit a house full of SDS people up in East Lansing. And Bill would walk into the room, and if there was a woman there he hadn't slept with, he would walk over to her, and I'm not kidding, this is not an exaggeration. He would say, "How about let's make love?" And she'd say, "Yes," and they'd go right upstairs and make love. It happened over and over and over, and there wasn't hardly a woman I knew that he hadn't slept with. And he was very confident and very suave, and he had a way of expressing himself that was, very apt and confident. And I would say something stumbling, and he would make fun of me. And at one point I said to Bill, "Don't you understand how easy it is for you to make fun of me? I don't have any of the kind of background. I'm not the kind of person you are. For me to be a youth movement person is difficult. I have to learn. You do it naturally." And at one point he said, "Yeah, I understand that." And he laid off of me a little bit after that too, because he didn't make fun of me as much. Now I have to tell you about the Progressive Labor Organization. It formed in the late 50s after the split between the Soviet Union and China. Every communist party in the world went through some kind of a convolution because of the split between the Soviet Union and China, because they were, previous to that, equally loyal to both. And a lot of people came to be called Maoists, and they formed political organizations that were like the Communist Party, but favorable to China and not to the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of competition between the Communists and the Maoists. And the Maoists in the United States were called the Progressive Labor Organization. And in the 60s, when I was a member of the May 2nd movement in the early 60s, when I was still in New York, I knew a lot of the progressive labor people, and I joined the May 2nd movement, which was kind of a puppet organization of theirs. And I was close to them, but I was also very, very critical of their ideology, and we used to fight a lot. But their idea, well, they hate me when I say this. I can see many times I've seen them looking daggers at me for saying it like this. But their idea about world revolution, or revolution in the United States, was that the industrial workers would be the vanguard of the proletariat. They would be the first ones to discover that socialism was in their interest, and they would lead the rest of the working class in the United States in a communist party that eventually would become the socialist revolution. Now think of it, in 1960s, when the Vietnam War started and when it was being fought, the American working class, especially factory workers, were extraordinarily patriotic and very much in favor of the war in Vietnam, and very much against treason and dissension and things like that. And the working class of industrial workers of the United States, including in Detroit where I was, where there were so many automobile workers, they were our worst enemy. And they were our worst threat too, because they'd always wanted to beat us up. And they said, no, these people are going to be the vanguard of the revolution. And we should be conducting our organizing activities in a way that helps to organize the industrial working class. And I thought that was the silliest idea imaginable.
Buffalo area construction workers turning downtown Niagara Square into a sea of United States flags and conducting a demonstration that has been quite a different kind from the ones that have taken place here recently.
And that's why I developed the point of view that said that the vanguard of the revolution was the Third World guerrillas who were fighting against imperialism in the outskirts of the empire, and not the industrial workers in the United States. And they would say, oh, you just think the workers are sweaty racist pigs, and you don't have any faith in the workers at all. And I said, well, I don't think they're sweaty, racist pigs, but I don't have any confidence in their leadership to be our revolutionary vanguard. So in 1968, before I got back from Africa, the PL, they made a wholesale transfer. They trashed the May 2nd movement, just got rid of it, and they moved in force in SDS. And they moved in as a Marxist-Leninist centralized leadership organization that was going to run a front group. And they would have communist policies, but they wouldn't tell the people that they were working with what the communist policies were, but they were going to gradually radicalize them and win them over. Which is the most cynical and most arrogant imaginable policy. And they moved into SDS with that attitude. And they had such a condescending attitude toward the SDS members, who were mostly ordinary kids who had become somewhat radicalized by lifestyle matters and the war, and didn't have any sophisticated Marxist-Leninist views about how the state and the revolution was going to go. So they moved in, and they created quite a lot of dissension in our chapters. In every chapter, we would go there, and there would be all these hippies and youth culture types who are on our side, and then there'd be two of these fat bureaucratic guys who were, dogmatically Marxist-Leninist and pushing the line of PL. And we had a lot of difficulty with them. I had known them for years, and I didn't have that much difficulty with them. I knew they were wrong, and I had no willingness to go along with their ideas at all, but I knew them, and I worked with them, and I didn't think that it was necessary to expel them. But my friends began to be more and more intent on the idea that SDS had to be cleansed of the Progressive Labor Party. So we went to the Chicago Convention in June of 1969, and we gave out our manifesto.
I'm Mike Clancy, National Secretary of SDS, and this is Bernadine Dorn, Interorganizational Secretary.
SDS is not, and the movement in this country is not something that exists during the school year and is going to start up again in the fall, and if they have to worry about whether we're going to be in the streets in the fall. We're going to be on the streets and in every institution in this country from now on.
We're going to replace capitalism with socialism.
And we had a big meeting with a lot of different talk going on. The Black Panthers came in, and a few of them made speeches, and it looked like we were going to have an election, and the PL had packed the meeting with a lot of people, so there was a real question of whether they had a majority of the people there or not. We couldn't really tell by looking, but they might have had a majority. And on the third or fourth day of the convention, all of a sudden, Bernadine Dorn gets up and makes a speech saying that we're tired of PL, we're not going to work with them anymore, we want them out of our organization. Everybody who agrees with us, follow me into the next room. Yeah, this was a place called the Coliseum in Chicago, which was a hall, but next to it was an arena. I think it could be an ice arena or a basketball stadium, but it was real old and real decrepit. And that arena was just sitting empty. I don't think we were even supposed to be in that. I don't think we rented that part of it. But we all got up and walked out. I tried to get on the stage to make a speech saying we shouldn't split the organization, and I was prevented from making a speech by some of my own friends. And then when we got in the next room, I did get up and make a speech, and I told them what a terrible idea it was to expel a whole faction of the organization. Our organization should be a mass organization. It shouldn't have to have ideological purity. It didn't have to be only true believers of whatever line we were pushing. But it was all right for us who had particular points of view to argue for them, and PL would have just as much right to argue for their point of view as we did. I felt that we had an enormous advantage over the PL people because they were very staid and very conservative in their personal behavior, and they were nothing in common with the youth movement and the yippies and all the stuff that swirled around us. And I didn't see how PL could ever make a real dent in our leadership in the organization. And I wanted our organization to get bigger and bigger and be more massive, and there'd be lots of people loosely affiliated with it who didn't necessarily believe everything that we in the leadership believed. But it would get bigger, and it would be a mass organization in that sense. My friends didn't want to do that. And after I made that speech saying what a mistake it was to have left the auditorium and to have separated the organization, because a good half of the people stayed in the hall where we left them, they immediately got up and started a new organization, which they called SDS. And so for a while there were two organizations called SDS. But we had control of the national office and the treasury and a whole lot of other things, and their efforts to form a PL SDS faltered eventually and disappeared. So we went to a church, rented a church, and had a new meeting the next day with all of us, down to about 300 people now, 400. The original meeting of the SDS convention was probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. And we had a meeting, and immediately Bernadine Dorn got up and started making speeches against, vicious, hostile speeches against the people who were with us but not part of us. At that time, there were two factions within the, I call it the true SDS, but within the groups that were not PL, there were two factions, and one of them was us, the internationalists, and the other was a group that called themselves the Revolutionary Youth Movement, RIM, we called them. And she started making hostile speeches against them. And Mike Klunsky, who was their leader, came over to me and he said, "Jim, what period of time do you think this is? Do you think this is a time for unity, or do you think this is a time for division?" And I said, "Well, Mike, of course it's a time for unity. We shouldn't even have expelled PL in the first place, but we certainly should be getting together now. And I would favor a compromise candidate, a slate of candidates." Bernadine did not think so, and neither did the other several people of my group of 10 people. And I think maybe Jerry Long agreed with me a little bit, but he didn't take much of a stand. And I think almost all of us were pretty much in Bernadine's camp. And so she held an election. She was elected the national officer, and we had a weatherman slate of candidates, won all the national offices, and Revolutionary Youth Movement people walked out.
Last night, a minority group faction of the Students for a Democratic Society National Convention split off from the original. This faction included a majority of the previous leadership, whose anti-working class politics and practices have been exposed and defeated. They have lost the confidence of the majority of the organization, both on the campuses and at the convention. Recognizing this, they walked out of the convention hall, held their own meeting, and declared that Progressive Labor Party was purged from SDS.
As we are SDS, and they've been expelled because of their failure to support the struggles of the black people in this country and the other people fighting American imperialism, we're confident that it will be clear by the end of the summer who is SDS and what are the politics of SDS.
We will build a revolutionary youth movement capable of actively engaging in the war against the imperialists. We will escalate our attacks until imperialism is defeated in Vietnam. This fall, in Chicago, at the time the conspiracy trials begin, we will lead massive demonstrations against the war, in support of the Black Panther Party, and in solidarity with all political prisoners, including Huey P. Newton and the 8 under attack for last summer's righteous demonstrations.
So we're not only expelling PL, but we're expelling, effectively expelling, every bit of opposition we could have in the whole group. And that just struck me as crazy. It wasn't politic. It didn't have anything to do with politics. It had to do with wanting to be the #1 person and wanting to be dominant and not being able to work with anybody else. So I went back to Ann Arbor, or rather to Detroit. The convention is over, the summer is upon us, our new program for organizing people in Detroit is started. We've rented houses all over Detroit and we're living in them. There's about, 100 or 200 of us moved to Detroit and started this program. We lived about, 20, 25 people to a house. And we started our summer program. And I didn't even hear from the people in Chicago for a few weeks. Things were going well in Detroit. We were divided up into different kinds of groups. Some people were going around to high schools. Some people were going around to amusement parks and other places where you could find young people. And going to the colleges and doing organizational activities. We had some sensationally effective organizational activities. We went out one day. I didn't go, but I was not there. But half a dozen of my Detroit people went to the University of Detroit, which I think is a Catholic, what do you call them, Jesuit school. And they sat on a picnic bench outside in the luncheon area, and they started an argument with somebody about the Vietnam War. And other people just sidled up and joined in the argument. And pretty soon there's about 50 or 60 people, all of them standing around listening to speeches. And someone said, let's take this indoors. And they went inside to the main auditorium at the university. They turned on the sound system and they put up 2 lecterns and 2 microphones, and we had a mass meeting going. There must have been 2,000 people in that auditorium before the day was over. And we furiously argued about the war in Vietnam and our politics and things like that. And a whole lot of people that we didn't know came up to us afterwards and wanted to know more about what we do and what could they do and all that. And we organized a lot of people that way. At one point, Bill Ayers in the Chicago office and Terry Robbins called me and said, when are you having the next meeting of your whole group? And I said, tomorrow night. And they said, well, good, we're coming. And I said, why are you coming? And they said, well, we want to be there and be a part of the group. We want to see them and see what they're doing, and then blah, blah, blah. And they were already thinking of opposition between me and them. And I guess I was thinking of a little of opposition between me and them too, but I wasn't thinking of splitting. But that sent a message throughout the Weatherman group that there was now competition for leadership between me and the Chicago National Office. And especially these people, Bill and Terry and JJ and Bernadine, they were all very charismatic people. And they knew any meeting they went to, they would dominate. They would do all the talking. They would be glamorous. They would have fought the fight, and they would have war stories to tell. And they knew that if they came to the meeting, the only competition they would have would be me. And they wanted to extend their leadership over the whole organization. And I didn't realize I was arguing against that until we had been doing it for a while. But then I realized real dissension has set in. The 10 people who founded the Weatherman organization were now divided. And within a couple of months, we had a new emergence of leadership within the group. A group of 4 took over the group of 10, and pushed the other 6 of us aside. It was Terry Robbins, Bill Ayers, John Jacobs, and Bernadine. And Mark Rudd pushed aside. Howie Mucktinger pushed aside. Me and Jerry Long pushed aside. And a couple others. And they are the ones who started talking about seriously developing an underground organization. We had what we called a national action, which was going to be a big demonstration in Chicago on October the 8th, which was the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the trial of the Chicago 8.
Hoffman, right. Judge Hoffman.
Hoffman and fellow Yippie defendant Jerry Rubin put on boxing gloves. Others, including defendant Tom Hayden, took the proceedings more seriously. He challenged the idea that taunting police amounted to inciting a riot.
As for taunting, I've never been told that taunting is illegal. What we're accused of by many people in the government is precisely this business of taunting. Like, somehow we'd get a fair trial if we dressed up. Last year, we wouldn't have been attacked by police if we had called them Mr.
We're going to go there and, I don't know, raise hell. At first I thought, when we first moved to Detroit and we had a couple hundred people working full-time, I thought we were going to bring quite a lot of people from Detroit with us to the Chicago action. But as time went on, people started talking more and more about how violent it was going to be. And as we started talking about how violent it was going to be, fewer and fewer people were thinking of going. And the thought we had was that we would demonstrate. Chicago police are not going to give us a permit to demonstrate, so it's going to be an illegal demonstration. We would demonstrate, and when the police tried to break us up, we would fight the police and to try to stay in the streets and maybe form up someplace else or something like that.
This fall, in Chicago, we will lead massive demonstrations against the war in support of the Black Panther Party and in solidarity with all political prisoners.
The central slogan of this action, besides the demands, the specifics, is bring the war home.
We're building a revolutionary movement that will fight the internal army, which is the police force. Yes, more physical contact if that's necessary. Whatever it takes, we'll do, by any means possible.
I didn't even get to Chicago until midnight that night. We had to, at that time we had a lot of people watching us. The Detroit police had a red squad and the FBI had their people, and we were under surveillance most of the time, and we could tell a lot of the times who was surveilling us. And I went around to pick up several people who already had felony charges against them for previous actions and who were not supposed to leave the jurisdiction. So I had to kind of sneak around and find them and get, we did a lot of funny kind of stuff of intrigue, trying to get out of town with a car full of people that weren't supposed to leave town. And so we wound up not getting to Chicago until midnight. So the Michigan and Ohio outfit didn't show up until after the first demonstration was over. And that first demonstration was a massacre. The people did exactly what we said we were going to do. We were going to demonstrate without a permit, and if the police tried to break us up, we're going to fight back. They fought back, and they got the hell beat out of them. And a whole lot of them were in jail, and a whole lot more people had bloody heads. And the next day, there was going to be a women's demonstration. At this time we were getting more and more attuned to the idea of not being a male chauvinist organization and of promoting leadership amongst the women and to promoting women's issues in connection with all the other issues that we were emphasizing. So they went there. Bernadine was wearing a helmet and carrying a club, and a whole lot of the other women were there with helmets and stuff. And the police immediately went over and manhandled Bernadine and took her into custody and took her away in a paddy wagon. And then they made an announcement to the rest of the women, you're illegally demonstrating and you'll be arrested if you don't move out within 5 minutes. And all the other women, the police captain also said, and you must take off your helmets. All the other women took off their helmets and herded into the nearest underground train station and left. And this was just, to our way of thinking, this is about the worst disaster that could possibly happen. Not just that a group of weathermen had been intimidated and driven off the streets, but that they were women. And we were supposed to be trying to promote the idea that women could provide leadership in the organization. So that was a miserable failure. And then that night we had a meeting, a big mass meeting in a church. And by this time I was pretty demoralized. I did not know what I wanted to do. What my friends wanted to do wasn't working. I didn't have any better ideas. Our biggest demonstration was to be the next day on Sunday, and we're having a meeting to evaluate what we're doing and how to, and there must have been 300 or 400 people there. And they asked me to chair the meeting. So I said, okay, I'm going to chair the meeting because I'm not going to say anything anyway. I don't know what to say. So we had a meeting in which there was a lot of soul searching, and a lot of recriminations, and a lot of hostility, and a lot of confusion. We didn't know what to do. We had called a big demonstration and it wasn't big. We had said we weren't going to be driven off the streets, and we were. And we had a big demonstration coming up the next day, and we didn't know what to do. Somebody that night or the night before went out to a place in Chicago called Haymarket Square, where there's a big statue of a fireman. No, not a fireman, a policeman. And some policemen were hurt, and might even be one or two policemen were killed in 1886. And the statue was to commemorate this, memorialize this fallen police officer. And one of my people, I don't know who, one of weathermen, I don't know who, blew it up with dynamite.
And if Chicago police weren't already sufficiently fired up, the weathermen fanned the flames just before the days of rage by blowing up a statue honoring Chicago policemen.
Now we have an out-and-out defiant gesture by groups that have come in here to upset the city, and we wonder now what will happen. Now it's a statue, going to be a policeman performing his duty tomorrow, or what?
And I was to be the tactical leader that day. And we drove around a little while, around the Haymarket and around the Loop to look for, signs of what things were going to be like there. And we came upon a car full of plainclothes policemen. In those days, the plainclothes policemen always wore a little stick pin in their collar with a little red ball on the end of it. And that's how they knew each other. But that's how we knew with them too. And so these guys, all with their little red buttons on their lapels, pull up alongside of us. And one of them says to me, I'm sitting in the back seat, and he rolls down his window, and he's not this far from me. And he says, Jim, I just want you to know, when it starts today, your ass is mine. And to tell you the truth, he scared the hell out of me. I just couldn't imagine what was going to happen to me when he got a hold of me. Because some of these plainclothes policemen are really roughnecks, you know, and they're not mild characters. So we drove on out to we had a little sparring match, you know, shouting back and forth with the cops, but nothing much happened. And then we went out to the Haymarket statue and we lined up.
October 11th was the fifth and final day of rage. A few hundred protesters rallied at the base of the destroyed police statue and then headed into the Loop.
We marched down to the Loop, and that's that picture that you just, this one right here. That's us marching down toward the Loop. I see JJ. JJ has on a helmet, but there's Bill Ayers. And this guy over here, who's looking away at the moment, is named Larry Grathwohl. And Larry Grathwohl later turned out to be a police agent. He had been hired by the police to join our ranks and infiltrate. Well, not very long after this picture was taken, some people came to me and said, there are only a few cops at the next intersection. And if we break out there, we can get out and we can rampage through the rest of the Loop. So I said, okay, let's do it. So we got to the next intersection. We suddenly bolted, and there were cars parked everywhere, so we had to run between cars, and policemen everywhere, and plainclothes policemen everywhere. And we had to bust through them. And I and these people here in the front all got through. But behind us here, there are 200 or 300 people, and they don't bust through the first thing. They're next, you know, and by that time the police have assembled, and they got massacred. So many of them were hurt, and so many of them had bloody heads, and it was just a terrible thing. That was a very bloody period. There was about 10 or 15 minutes there where the blood really flowed, and a lot of people, friends of mine, were hurt badly. And I had this sense, well, we worked this out so that I could just slip right out of there and not get hurt, and all my friends are behind me and they're all getting massacred. So I didn't like that, but I didn't know exactly what to do. So the whole thing died down, and they had called out the National Guard, and the National Guard were marching up and down all the streets of the Loop with their rifles in position and all that. So it wasn't exactly a success as we had hoped. It wasn't what we wanted, to show defiance and show our ability to hold off the police or anything like that. But at least we didn't give in. And so everybody went home. And those of us in the Weather Bureau, the 10 people who started the Weatherman, we met. We had gone to the movies the night before, and we saw The Wild Bunch, which we identified with. And then the next day we had this meeting in this cabin. And I don't know if it's the first day or the second day, but the police showed up, quite a few of them, surrounded the cabin and made us come out. But they couldn't find anything particularly bad. There might have been a rented car there. I don't know about that. So we had meetings for 2 or 3 days straight. And you can imagine we had a lot of things to straighten out, going all the way back to the convention in Chicago in the previous June. I had made speeches which they didn't agree with, which they didn't like. I had tried to keep them out of the leadership of the Ohio and Michigan area. I had chaired that meeting in which I didn't intend to say anything, but I did say that I thought we made a lot of mistakes. And we had a lot of talk. And the funny thing about it was there was in those days a thing called a criticism and self-criticism session, which was a Chinese phrase. The Chinese used it. They used to go into a people's commune and have criticism and self-criticism sessions where all the people would be able to criticize the leaders and other people, and people were supposed to submit to self-criticism and learn by having had their behavior criticized. So we had a criticism and self-criticism session in which I was the subject. But for some reason, the focus of the whole thing became not that I was a revisionist or that I was a moderate or that I didn't favor violence or any of the things that they really disagree with me about. They condemned me for being a male chauvinist. And when we're at the meetings then after the national action, the criticism all came to be, why does Jim have these special relationships with these young girls who don't participate fully but who just act like girls? So by this time, you see, the organization is starting to split. Now, we're very close, we're very tight, and we're very, very good friends, all of us. And to have a disagreement like this was very difficult for us to deal with. And we didn't know how to talk about it. I said to Bill one time, I think I'm going to quit. And he said, you can't quit, you're in it for life. And I thought about it for a minute, and he meant it. He figured we were going to go do this stuff, do it, and then we're all going to go to prison and be in there for years and years, and when we come out, we'll be veteran revolutionaries. And I had no intention of going to any prison, and I certainly didn't have any intention of continuing to be a part of a group that was going off in a direction that I didn't want to be a part of. So we had our difficulties. The next month, in November 15th of 1969, there was, as I mentioned, a big demonstration in Washington. And there must have been 1 million people there. And it was all from the, I don't know if you know Washington, D.C., but from the Justice Department over to the Washington Monument was solid people. But then it came that time again, as at all demonstrations, well, what do we do now? We've been here, we've made a noise, we've shown it, what do we do now? And all my friends wanted to go and do something destructive. They do something, don't just meekly file out of the place and go home. And I was tactical leader that day. I seem to always be tactical leader during the days when these awful things are happening. And I was with Ted Gold. Ted Gold was a New York, a Columbia person who was from New York. He's a great kid. He was killed in the explosion in Greenwich Village a few months later. Ted Gold was a baseball fan, and we used to joke with him that we'd have to wait to have the revolution until after Willie Mays retired, because he would never be a part of a revolution as long as Willie Mays was playing. So he and I were the tactical leaders, and we filed around the edges of the Justice Department and across the street. I think it's Massachusetts Avenue right there. There's a shopping district, stores and people shopping, lots of big glass windows. And a lot of my friends had big pieces of metal in their hand. And so Teddy and I directed them. We charged the shopping center. And people started busting everything. They turned over a police car. They busted out the store windows at Woody's and other big department stores. And it was just hell on wheels. And one of the things that happened is that some ordinary people got infiltrated into the middle of us. And our people started beating the hell out of whatever civilians they saw. had them down on the street, hitting them in the head and kicking them. And I pulled some of my friends off, a couple of different people, and I kept telling them, the people are not the enemy. And that they felt the people were the enemy. They felt that, we're a tiny minority and we're fighting for our lives. And so they were beating people up very badly. I was getting a reputation of being anti-something or other, not sufficiently militant anyway. So then the demonstrations are over in Washington. We all go back to Michigan. And in this time, we had formed a new group in Boston. We hadn't had much of a weatherman presence in Boston before, or Cambridge. And the leader of the Boston group was a man named Eric Mann, who had been in SDS for many years and was a prima donna and a very self-centered person. And for him, the revolution was him and what he was doing and nothing else. But I wasn't very successful in Boston. I had a lot of people there who could see my point of view and would talk to me about it, but Eric was very dominant, and he had the vast majority of the group on his side. And they staged some very violent encounters. So Eric had a warrant out for him, and he and his lawyer negotiated that he would turn himself in at the police station. So we staged a demonstration down at the police station. The over the balcony business happened before I got there. But I'm there now, and we staged a demonstration in front of the Boston police station. And must have been about 60 or 70 of us there, and that many policemen and plainclothes policemen at least an equal number. And the very same thing happened. A really rough-looking cop, a plainclothes policeman, came up to me and said, "Jim, when it starts, I want you to know your ass is mine." He said the same damn thing. But then he went like this, boom. He used his elbow into my solar plexus and knocked the breath completely out of me. I staggered and fell up against the wall. I couldn't breathe, and I was miserable. And then Eric shows up in a taxi cab to turn himself in, and the fighting starts. And so there's this bloody battle going on. I don't know why. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to what we're doing. I mean, is he turning himself in, or are we there to have a fight? I didn't understand that we were going to fight the policeman. But anyway, I'm trying to recover from my chest exploding, and there's a big fight going on, and Eric gets doubled over and taken into the police station and put in the jail cell. He didn't get out for quite a while either. So my adventure at being a weatherman leader in Boston didn't turn out to be very effective. I didn't do very much, even though I had a lot of people there that I could communicate with and were on the same page as me about forming a mass movement and not just for having violent street fights. There was the general notion that wherever we wanted to demonstrate against the war or in favor of black equality or whatever we were going to demonstrate about, that we should have the right to demonstrate, and that we should not be forced out of our place to demonstrate by the police, even if they wouldn't give us a permit. And so almost all the time the violence started because people would not disperse when the policeman told them to disperse. And almost all of the violence took place with my friends doing these kinds of things, hitting policemen and pushing them out of the way and all that, in order to resist being dispersed. But amongst us, it was showing the flag. It was showing that we were there and that they couldn't disperse us, we couldn't be intimidated, and that we were going to fight back. We lost complete sight of what we were trying to do in terms of building a mass movement against the war and for racial equality, and what it would take to draw in the people who are not yet committed. There are lots of people who sympathize with us, but they weren't going to go out and get their heads split for nothing. And they didn't really see the rectitude of going out and attacking policemen. And so we had a real problem of how to recruit on the basis of a tactic that scared the hell out of most people. We had a slogan those days, it was called "Do It." By that we meant do something aggressive, do something active, do something existential. Don't be passive.
I mean, I'm a contradiction if I'm saying follow what I say or do what I say. I'm saying I'm trying to speak to each one of you, and I hope I'm setting something off. If I'm setting something off, and you'll know what to do. You'll know the action to take, and you'll take that action.
And people who didn't have it in them to do it were criticized heavily. And I got to where I was being criticized heavily because I didn't seem to have it in me to do it. The do it that I was not favoring was that I was not leading organizations or demonstrations that led to violence, and I was not leading, encouraging other people to step up and do it. But a lot of the people, they were just being criticized because they were timid in the streets and they didn't do much of anything. I have always said, and you can probably find this in writing in a few places, that what happened was that we substituted for the idea that we would organize people and get a larger group of people and build a mass movement of people, an overwhelming number of people who would eventually force the government to stop the war. You know, we came very close to that. With 1 million people in Washington, D.C., and the violence that took place and all that, the Nixon administration had a hard time. They promised every way which they could that they'd bring the troops home, but they wanted a decent interval. They wanted this fighting to stop in Vietnam, and then a decent interval, and then the Americans would leave, because they didn't want to look like they were chased out. So they wanted a decent interval. That was Kissinger's phrase. We substituted for that a notion of what was becoming called, copying a French phrase from 1968, exemplary behavior. We're all of us responsible for being exemplary. And exemplary behavior meant to do something aggressive, violent, noticeable, so it's going to attract a lot of attention. It's going to make people think that things are very serious and coming to a head. And my friends in the Weather Bureau, they started talking about themselves being exemplars. One day we were in Chicago in December of '69, and we found a guy who would let us have a meeting in his house so that we wouldn't have to go to one of our regular places, and the cops wouldn't know where we were. So we went to this house, but there were surveillance on the street, and we knew we were being watched going in there. So we're sitting in this house, and the door is right on the street. And I'm talking to Bill, and he pulls out of his pocket a holster and a .38 revolver. And I said, Bill, what are you doing with that? And he said, motherfuckers come in here, I'm gonna shoot them. And I said, if a policeman comes in here now and busts in, you're gonna shoot him? Can you be serious? And he said, goddamn right I'm serious. I'm not taking it anymore, or something like that. And I was just aghast. He's going to shoot them if they came in the door. And that's when the distance between us really, really developed. Because I felt like I was still living in the real world, and these people were starting to live in a fantasy world. quarter has come around. It's time for SDS to have another quarterly meeting. So we're going to have a quarterly meeting, but nobody will rent any place to us. Certainly not the university at Ann Arbor is not going to give us a hall to have a meeting. So people looked and looked and looked, and they finally went to Flint, and they found a dance hall. Just an ordinary building was big enough to be a dance hall that was in a black neighborhood and was a place where a lot of black musicians played, and a lot of black people came on Saturday nights, I guess, and danced. They rented us their hall for a weekend. So here we are. It's, I don't know, 30 degrees below zero, and Flint, Michigan, which is a bitter, hard-bitten town anyway. We're in a black neighborhood, and all the black people are looking at us and wondering, what are you people doing here? And we're having a meeting. And my flamboyant friends, they put up a big sign that said, "Wargasm." And I had never heard the word before. I don't know if it is a word. And we were going to have this meeting. So the first thing that happens is that Tom Hayden, of all people, who is not a weatherman and not even an extremist in any sense, you probably know he was a California state senator for decades, he got up and gave us karate lessons. Gave the whole group of us. There were only about 150 of us there. We were diminished considerably by then. And he gave us karate lessons. We're all up in the hallway, dance hall, practicing karate moves. And then we all made speeches. And I made a speech in which I said, we have made a terrible mistake. We'd gone way off in what I called a left deviation. That is, we were deviated from the proper line in a lefty direction by being adventurous and by being extreme and by provoking violence that was only going to redound to our detriment, not to our benefit. And I made a very bitter speech, and it was received very, very poorly. Some people didn't even wait till I was finished before they walked out. And then Bernadine Dorn got up and made a speech in which she said, dig it. Charles Manson and his friends, they went into a Hollywood star's house and they killed the bitch. And then, while she's laying there dead, they went and got the food that the woman's family were about to eat, and they ate, sitting there amongst the dead bodies. And then, dig it, when they finished eating, they stuck a fork in Sharon Tate's belly. And I thought, who is up there talking? What is she saying? What reality, what world is she living in? The last thing we should have ever done was to mention Charles Manson in any way whatsoever. Certainly wouldn't want anybody to think of us and them in the same breath. But Bernadine had gone completely over the edge. But nothing much happened at the Flint, Michigan wargasm. I think I might have had sex with nearly every woman there. But, and also it was cold, bitterly cold. And even with 150 of us in there, it wasn't any warmer. And they rented us the place, but they didn't rent us the heater. I found Bernadine after her speech, and I asked her if she wouldn't go out someplace and have coffee with me. And I talked to her, and I said, Bernadine, we're making a terrible mistake. We took over SDS, and now we've almost ruined it. It hardly exists anymore. The chapters don't have any connection with the old home office anymore. every time we go any place in public to have a demonstration, no one else will come because they're afraid we're going to have guns and we're going to have violence and they're going to get killed. And we've given up the idea of forming a mass movement. A mass movement doesn't mean that every person in the organization is a devoted communist who carries a card and sworn to do their duty. On the contrary, a mass movement is a large number of people who sympathize with your politics, but who some of whom are dedicated activists and some of them are only peripherally involved. And for that, we need hundreds of thousands of people. And we're not doing that. And she said, I don't know what's come over you. I don't know why you've changed. But I used to think that you could do it. I wanted you to be the national leader a year ago. But you seem to be the kind of person who could do it. And you're not anymore. And you better get hot. You better do something, because people are losing complete faith and confidence in you. So I had made a political criticism of what the organization was doing, and she made a personal criticism of what I was doing. And that's how it went from then on. It wasn't anything to do with politics at all. Did you have the courage, and did you want to be a member of the underground, and did you want to plant bombs, and did you want to do things clandestinely? And that was it. After talking that talk with Bernadine, I pretty much decided that I was finished. I was not going to be able to reach my friends. I was not going to be able to bring them back from this brink. And what they were going to do was crazy, something we would be ashamed of for the rest of our lives. And a week later, after the Flint, Michigan conference was over, we had another meeting in another guy's house in Chicago. It was on the day of the Super Bowl. And we stopped the meeting in order to watch the Super Bowl on television. And I got up and went out. And I kept going. I got on the subway and rode all the way across Chicago out to near O'Hare Airport. Rented a room. Watched the rest of the Super Bowl. And the next day I flew to Boston. And I was going to gather up some people that I thought would be a rump organization, that we would be the dissenters in the weather organization, and it became clear to me very quickly that that wasn't going to happen. And there were a lot of people who were very, very disturbed about where the weatherman was going, but they didn't have any ideas themselves about what to do. And it seemed like for the next several months, everybody I talked to, they would say, yeah, they went off the deep end. They really became extremist. Now, we should start something ourselves. I think we should get some dynamite and blow up a police station. And why do you want to blow up a police station? What good is that going to do? That's not going to make the movement against the war larger or stronger. It's going to have the exact opposite effect. When I would say those things, I couldn't get anybody to agree with me. And I was sitting there in the airport in Boston after several days of traveling around, having conversations. And I became very demoralized.
I brought up the subject of what's going to happen after we take over the government. We become responsible then for administrating, 250 million people. And there was no answers. No one had given any thought to economics. How are you going to clothe and feed these people? The only thing that I could get was that they expected that the Cubans and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Russians would all want to occupy different portions of the United States. They also believed that their immediate responsibility would be to protect against what they called the counter-revolution. And they felt that this counter-revolution could best be guarded against by creating and establishing re-education centers in the Southwest, where we would take all the people who needed to be re-educated into the new way of thinking and teach them how things were going to be. I ask, well, what is going to happen to those people that we can't re-educate, that are die-hard capitalists? And the reply was that they'd have to be eliminated. And when I pursued this further, they estimated that they would have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. And when I say eliminate, I mean kill. 25 million people. I want you to imagine sitting in a room with 25 people, most of which have graduate degrees from Columbia and other well-known educational centers, and hear them figuring out the logistics for the elimination of 25 million people. And they were dead serious.
I guess I haven't communicated much about the surveillance and the bullying by the FBI and the police, but I knew I was under surveillance most of the time. And I was afraid, like these guys come up and hitting me the way that one guy did, I was afraid that I was going to be isolated. I will be easy to pick off because I'm no longer with the organization, and they could say to me, 20 years in prison, or tell us everything you know about what they're planning. And that scared me. And so I really did want to be out of the country to get out from under that pressure. And if I'd have met JJ on the street at that time, I think I would have gone the other direction, because I think that was what he thought. He thought that any of us who tried to get out would have to be punished. He even said one time we'd have to kill you, but I don't know if he meant that. And the others in the organization, I didn't think they would do anything like that. And suddenly I went over to the counter of Mexicana Airlines and bought a ticket to Mexico City. And I got on an airplane in Mexico City, or I got on an airplane in Boston and flew to Mexico City. Landed in Dallas in the middle of the night, and then changed planes and flew to Mexico City. And the next day I was sitting in a coffee shop on the Alameda in Mexico, and not having any idea where I was going, what I was going to do, what was the next thing to do. But I knew I was finished with them. Well, what they did do, the remainder of the Weather Bureau, they went around to about a half a dozen chapters and met with them and said, you're in, you're out, you're no good, you're no good, you're no good, you're in. And they took with them a group of must have been 50 people. And they excluded maybe a couple of hundred other people who were full-time living in our houses and participating in our activities. They were all just cast aside. And those were very difficult times. I'm talking about this like, you know, I'm sitting here in my armor here 50 years later, and it's easy to talk about it. But at the time, it was very, very difficult. One friend of mine threw himself in front of a Superbowl car after he was told that he couldn't go underground. And at least a half a dozen friends of mine were admitted to mental hospitals because their parents thought they'd lost their minds, and they wanted them incarcerated in a mental hospital so they wouldn't go out and do those crazy things anymore. And an awful lot of our people were extraordinarily demoralized. Not just because they were singled out as not good enough for the underground, but also because everything that we had dedicated ourselves to, fought so hard for, and taken so many risks for, and been so much a part of our identity, was being trashed and just thrown aside. And only people who were going to plant bombs were going to be worthy of anything after that. And I was running out of money, and so I flew to Los Angeles, and I looked up my mother. And I found my mother and my sister, who's a grown-up girl by now, and I hardly know her. And I stayed with my mother for, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks. When I came to the airport in Los Angeles, I guess I told her I was coming because she and my sister were there waiting for me. And as we were walking down the concourse to come out of the airport, I kept looking behind me to see if anybody was following me. And my mother said, "Nobody's following you. Nobody's following you. Don't be silly." And I wasn't being silly. I had very good reason to believe I would be followed. But she just couldn't take it seriously. And she never said a word to me about my politics. She didn't really much want to talk about it either. She didn't say anything to me about it. My sister, who was 16 at the time, she asked me a lot of questions. And I tried to communicate to her what I was doing with my life and why I got to the point where I was and all that. But my sister never showed even the slightest bit of interest or sympathy. She always liked me, and she always wanted me to come visit, and she really wanted us to be brother and sister, but she had no good feeling at all about politics or anything like that. Then I went to San Francisco and stayed with some old friends of mine, the Wardlaws. And they kind of took care of me. I was sort of a basket case. That's when I first heard of Sesame Street. They had 2 little girls. They were 6 and 5, I think. And I was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. And every morning they'd come and jump into bed with me and turn on Sesame Street. And it was just, so ironic to me that here's this heavy-duty street-fighting man. He's laying there with these 6-year-olds watching Sesame Street. And I loved it. Well, so anyway, the Weathermen then formed an underground. And I don't know very much about what they did, but I know they went all to different cities and they all took on new identities. And they kept close in touch with each other and they met a lot. And they planned what they like to call strategic sabotage, which is a pretentious name because it could hardly be anything like strategic. But they got a hold of some dynamite. They stored the dynamite in the basement of a house on a side street in Greenwich Village, a townhouse. And Bill Ayers, or no, not Bill, Diana Oughton, Bill Ayers' girlfriend, and Ted Gold, the Willie Mays fan, and Terry Robbins were in the basement fooling with the dynamite, doing something, I don't know what, but they set it off. And they blew up the whole townhouse and themselves.
Sisters and brothers, the head of the Police Sergeants Association called emotionally for all-out war between the pigs and us. We accepted. Guard your banks, guard your children, guard your doors.
Kathy Wilkerson, whose parents' townhouse it was way upstairs on the 3rd or 4th floor, and she wasn't hurt, but she had a hell of a time getting out of the building and getting away, but she wasn't hurt. One thing I always laugh about is that Kathy Wilkerson, who was one of our leaders and a very serious woman, and she's still around, she still writes things now and then, she got out of the townhouse on one day. Don't know where she spent the night, but the next night she showed up at a dentist appointment for her orthodontic work at a dentist's office uptown in New York. the explosion happened, and these 3 blasted bodies were found, and they couldn't tell who they were. For months, nobody knew who died in that explosion. And I met some people on the street in San Francisco, and they said they had been in touch with the Weather Underground. So I asked them to find out for me who was dead. And they found out for me, and I met them back, and they told me who the 3 people were. And it was just devastating to me. Partly just because they were my good friends and I loved them so, but also because they blew themselves up with dynamite, which is just the exact thing that I was telling them not to do. And I felt just... A lot of times when you leave an organization like that because you can't agree with it, you feel a responsibility to the other people that you didn't bring them along with you, or that you didn't do something to protect them from the lunacy that the organization went on to do. An awful lot of people were in very bad condition after that, and I felt, I can't say that I felt guilty in the sense that I had done anything wrong, but I sure felt miserable. Well, they went through a real upheaval because of the explosion. I only learned in the last few months that John Jacobs, JJ, the real militant of them all, was expelled from the organization at that time. He was the one that was most in favor of bombing and dynamite and stuff. And they expelled him, and he went off by himself, and nobody heard much about him for a long time. But the rest of them got some more dynamite, and they decided, and I only know this from the newspapers, they decided that they were going to go to the Officers Club at Fort Dix in New Jersey, which is a big army base, and they were going to smuggle the dynamite in and wait till a Saturday night when they're having a dance there at the Officers Club at the army base, and they were going to blow the whole place up, people and all. Now, I know that if they did that in Vietnam, if the National Liberation Front people did that in Vietnam, they blew up an army base full of American officers, that was an act of war. And I don't know if I could set off the dynamite, but I can understand what they're doing. And, you know, it makes some sense that they're fighting a war. But to go to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and kill off a bunch of soldiers and their girlfriends? They didn't do it, no. They didn't do it. They couldn't make it happen. They had a hard time getting it organized. But they did set off some bombs in bathrooms of police stations in a few cities around the country. No one was ever hurt in any of their explosions. And I don't know, the FBI seemed to try very hard to catch them. And they never did catch them. And that was remarkable to me because they seemed like such bumblers. And I could believe they could set off the dynamite and kill themselves, but I didn't think that they were going to set off dynamite in other places. Bill Ayers was quoted years later after he came out from being a fugitive. He's quoted as saying, "Guilty as hell, free as a bird, it's a wonderful country." It is true, when I was a young man, I was angry. And oftentimes it was for things that seemed quite legitimate to me to be angry about, because I was a socialist and against the war and against black exploitation and things like that, and the world wasn't a good place, and I disagreed with an awful lot of what Americans seem to believe in. But it was more than that. I was a lonely and isolated kid, alienated. I mean, you can see I was living in a hotel when I was 16 years old. And my parents were just irresponsible. They gave up any idea of having any authority over me at all after I was about 14. And so I was insecure and shy. I was a bit of a baby until I was, you know, well up in my 20s. And I was full of anger. And it's this thing about what I was saying earlier on the anti-authoritarian, that sounds abstract, but I do have a visceral approach to an awful lot of things that strike me as authoritarian. And people get tired of hearing me rant on about, you know, what's bad about this and what's bad about that. Well, I am not as close to political issues as I used to be. I still think the same way. I still have basically a Marxist analysis of the world, and I still read an awful lot about politics and history. But I am not so personally moved by issues as I used to be. Another thing that has happened, of course, is that I have studied revolution, and I've studied our own situation enough to know that millions of people have lost their lives, and that the violence that's going on in the world is just so terrible that sometimes you wonder if people wouldn't be better off if they remained being exploited as long as they could keep their lives. Like Aleppo just discourages me so much. I get furious when I'm sitting here watching TV and seeing what's happening in Aleppo. I mean, those people are going through hell, dropping bombs on them every day. And I'm very fond of Mexico. I've been a Mexico-phile for a long time. And I've always been a big fan of the Mexican Revolution and of Villa and Zapata, people like that. But in recent years, I think how many people died and what they paid for that revolution and what little they got out of it. I sometimes wonder about revolutionary politics and the cost of it. Now, most people say, oh, well, the revolution usually turns on its own children and it usually devours itself, and that the revolution is a waste of time. I don't say that, but I do say, look at Mexico. They shot them down like thousands and thousands at a time. And all those guys got up, put on their big sombreros and got their guns out, and they went to fight for the country. And so many of them were killed. And I wonder, sometimes I think politics is not exactly not a spectator sport. Ideas have lives, and sometimes ideas are vital, and it seems like this is an idea whose time come, and this is one that's going to really march over the world and make a difference. But then there are times when ideas seem exhausted. And what had a lot of meaning last year, it doesn't mean that much now. And my idea about third world revolution and the politics of the third world and anti-imperialism, I don't think any differently about it really in terms of analytical terms, but they've moved on a long ways from the days of the 1960s when there were independent countries popping up everywhere, and when there were revolutionary leaders in every society and guerrilla wars going on. You know, Africa's a mess. I felt very strongly about the African Revolution when I was there. But since I left Africa, it's just a mess. And I don't know whose side I'd be on if I were there. But on the other hand, when these people do things like Occupy Wall Street, I think, damn, that's the right thing to do. They're right. They've got to do it. I don't know if it's going to do any good, but they've got to do it. And I guess there's a kind of an existential quality in me that says that even if it isn't going to work, you got to do it. Even if you're not going to be successful, you're not going to make a revolution, but you can't stand aside. You have to be a part of what's going on. So I don't look back on the 60s with regret, not a bit. And I don't even regret what I did, although some things that I wanted to do turned up topsy-turvy. I still don't regret what I tried to do and what I was a part of. So I went into employment law, and I found myself with a practice that was very gratifying to me, because these people were being taken advantage of, and I had an opportunity to sometimes make it right. It just seems to be in my nature from the very start.